Silas Greer had learned early that grief didn't announce itself on a schedule. It arrived on quiet Tuesday mornings when he was sanding a cabinet door and the smell of cedar suddenly reminded him of Karen's shampoo. It arrived in the middle of supper when his daughter said something funny, and he instinctively turned toward the chair that had been empty for 3 years. It arrived, and then it stayed, settling into the furniture of daily life until a man couldn't always tell where the grief ended and where he began. He ran a small woodworking shop at the edge of Tanner Falls, a town of 4,000 people in the limestone country of eastern Ontario, where the winters were long and the main street had more empty storefronts than occupied ones. The shop was called Greer & Co., which his daughter Lottie had pointed out was a strange name for a business with only one person in it. He had laughed and told her the name Co. stood for her. She had accepted this without further question, which was the kind of easy grace she had inherited from her mother. He was 39 years old. He had lost Karen to a sudden brain aneurysm when Lottie was 6, which meant that for 3 years he had been learning, with varying degrees of success, to be 2 parents at once. He managed. He always managed. The shop paid the bills mostly. The house on Birchwood Lane was old but warm. Lottie was fed and loved and doing well in school. When he felt the weight of everything pressing down, the overdue equipment loan, the heating bill, the constant arithmetic of just enough, he reminded himself that enough was more than some people ever got. On a Wednesday in late September, a black Range Rover pulled into the gravel lot beside his shop. Silas noticed it from the open workshop door. Vehicles like that didn't often park in Tanner Falls, and when they did, it was usually someone who had taken a wrong turn off the county road. The woman who stepped out was not lost. Gemma Fairchild moved the way people moved when they were accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around their arrival. She was somewhere in her early 40s, dressed in clothes that were expensive in the particular way that quietly expensive things never announced themselves loudly. Her company, Fairchild Hospitality Group, owned a chain of boutique hotels across Ontario and Quebec that catered to the kind of traveler who expected artisan details and locally sourced everything. She had placed an order with Silas 6 weeks earlier for a custom-built display shelf to anchor the lobby of her new Muskoka property. Solid white oak, hand-jointed with inlaid walnut trim along the top edge. He had spent 4 of those 6 weeks on it. She walked into the shop without knocking, looked at the shelf where it stood finished against the far wall, and said nothing for a long moment. "The left bracket is off," she said. Silas looked up from the workbench where he had been sealing a different piece. He set down his brush and walked over. "Where?" She pointed. He looked. The bracket was correct. He had checked it against the specification drawing 3 times before calling the job done. "The spec calls for 44 millimeters from the wall edge," he said. "That's what it is." Gemma tilted her head slightly. "My eye says otherwise." "Your eye is welcome to measure it." She did not reach for a measuring tape. She walked around the shelf once, pressed 2 fingers lightly against the surface, and made a small sound of mild displeasure. "The finish is heavier than I expected." 3 coats of oil, same as specified in writing. She turned to face him then with the expression of someone doing arithmetic in their head and reaching a conclusion they had already decided on before the numbers were calculated. "I think we need to revisit the invoice." He handed it across the counter. The amount was $285. Materials and labor, exactly as quoted and agreed upon 6 weeks prior. Gemma looked at the number and let out a short, quiet laugh. Not the kind of laugh that meant something was funny. The kind that meant something was beneath consideration. "For a shelf," she said. "For a custom white oak display shelf with hand-cut joinery and walnut inlay that took 4 weeks of evenings and weekends," Silas said. He kept his voice level. She set the invoice back on the counter without folding it. "I'll have my assistant follow up." She said it the way people say it when they mean they will not follow up. Then she picked up her keys, walked back to the Range Rover, and was gone before the gravel finished settling behind her tires. Silas stood in the open doorway and watched the vehicle reach the end of the lane and turn without slowing. Behind him, from the small office at the back of the shop where she did her homework after school, Lottie appeared. She was 9 years old with her mother's dark eyes, and the patient, watchful quality of a child who had learned that the world sometimes required careful observation before it made sense. "She didn't pay," Lottie said. "It wasn't a question." "No." "Did you do the shelf wrong?" "No." Lottie was quiet for a moment, chewing on the end of her pencil the way she always did when she was working something through. Silas reached over and gently removed the pencil from her mouth before answering. It was such an automatic gesture, worn smooth by 3 years of repetition, that it softened something in his chest every time. Some people decide ahead of time what something is worth, he said, and sometimes they've already decided it isn't worth what you're asking, no matter what the work actually is. That's not fair. It's not. Are you going to call someone? A lawyer or something? He almost smiled at that, the practicality of it so purely hers. No, sweetheart. Why not? He looked out at the empty lane. The oaks along the road were already turning orange and rust against the gray September sky. Karen had loved October for exactly that reason. She used to say autumn was nature's way of proving that letting go could be beautiful. He had thought that was a lovely thing to say and also slightly wrong, but he had never told her that. Because $285 isn't worth the energy it takes to be angry, he said. It was only half true, and some part of Lottie's expression suggested she understood that. What she could not have known, and what Silas himself did not know, was that there had been a third vehicle parked further up the lane during Gemma's visit. A gray sedan, rental plates facing away from the shop. The man inside had arrived 20 minutes before Gemma and had still not left. His name was August Fairchild. He was 71 years old, semi-retired, and he was Gemma's father. He had come to Tanner Falls on separate business, a meeting with a former associate at a property near the lake, but he had made a point of stopping here first. He had heard through his assistant that Gemma's custom order from a local craftsman was ready for collection. He had wanted to see the shop out of a habit of curiosity that had served him well in business for 4 decades. He had not expected to witness what he witnessed. August sat in the parked car for a long time after the Range Rover disappeared around the bend. He was a man who paid close attention to the things people did when they believed the outcome was already settled. He had built Fairchild Hospitality from a single 6-room inn in Prince Edward County into a company with 17 properties, and he had done it by understanding that the character of the people around you was the one thing a balance sheet could never accurately measure. What he had watched troubled him, not only because his daughter had refused to pay a craftsman, though that troubled him too and deeply, but because of what came afterward. The man had not shouted, had not followed the vehicle, had turned back into his shop, crouched beside his daughter, said something that made the girl nod slowly and return to work. August had also noticed, through the open workshop window, a photograph tacked to the wall above the bench. A woman, dark-haired, smiling, positioned at an angle that suggested it had been adjusted many times over a long period to keep it straight. That detail, more than anything else, stayed with him on the drive to the lake. That evening in his hotel room, August called his longtime solicitor, a careful and precise woman named Beverly Cho. "I need you to look into someone," he said. "A woodworker in Tanner Falls. His name is Silas Greer." A brief pause. "A woodworker. He has a shop called Greer & Co. I'd like to know who he actually is." "How thorough?" "Thorough enough to tell me the kind of man he is, not his credit rating, the actual man." Beverly said she would begin in the morning. The following morning, Silas opened the shop at 7, as he always did. The shelf still stood against the wall, finished and uncollected. He had no expectation of being paid now, which was a specific kind of disappointment, not the sharp kind that surprised you, but the dull, settled kind a person carried back to work without ceremony. Around mid-morning, an older woman named Vera Pollock arrived with a kitchen chair that had split along the seat. She was a retired schoolteacher, one of the first people who had welcomed Karen and Silas when they arrived in Tanner Falls 11 years ago. Silas looked at the chair and gave her an estimate of $40 for materials and an hour of work. "That's too little," Vera said immediately. "It's $40 worth of work." She looked at him over her reading glasses. "You're a terrible businessman, you know." "So I've been told." He fixed the chair. When Vera tried to add a tip on her way out, he waved it off and told her to drop chairs off any time she was passing. No need to make a special trip. An hour later, a young man named Devon came in asking about a broken step on his front porch. He was not yet 30 and had recently been laid off from a mill operation 2 towns over. He had a toddler at home, he explained, and the porch step was a safety issue he couldn't afford to fix properly right now. Silas drove out to the house in his truck, looked at the step, replaced the 2 boards that were rotted through, charged nothing for the labor, and declined the $20 Devon pressed into his hand 3 separate times before giving up. In the afternoon, an elderly veteran named Bernard Lecomte came by to collect a cabinet Silas had built for him at cost the month before. Bernard had served in the 80s, lived alone on the north side of town, and carried himself with the careful, self-contained dignity of a man who had never in his life asked for help easily. Silas loaded the cabinet into Bernard's truck himself, refused the handshake money Bernard tried to slip him, and spent 10 minutes talking hockey with the old man in the parking lot just because Bernard seemed like he could use the conversation. None of these moments were performed. None of them were designed to impress anyone. Each one was simply Silas Greer being Silas Greer on a Thursday in September, the same as every other Thursday before it. Beverly Cho spent 2 days in Tanner Falls. She spoke with the school principal, 2 town councilors, the owner of the hardware store, a minister, 3 neighbors, and the woman who had run the local Legion for the past decade. She filled 6 pages of a legal pad. She called August on Friday evening. "Well," he said, "he's exactly what Tanner Falls thinks he is." She turned through her notes. The hardware store owner says he never negotiates on material costs but regularly discounts his own labor for people he knows are stretched. The school principal says he built new bookshelves for the library last winter and invoiced them for materials only, no labor. The Legion says he repaired their meeting room floor 3 years ago after the spring flooding and charged nothing. A town councilor told me that when the municipality couldn't find budget for the cenotaph restoration, Silas did all the woodwork and submitted an invoice for $50. August was quiet. "He's raising a daughter alone," Beverly continued. "His wife died 3 years ago. He carries an equipment loan. The shop barely breaks even in the slower months, and by most financial measures, he's one difficult quarter away from a serious decision about his building lease. And in spite of all of it, yes, not one person I spoke to had a negative word. The closest thing to complaint I found was a woman who said he undercharges for his work and it sometimes makes people uncomfortable because they can see he could be asking for considerably more." August smiled faintly. He was standing at the window of his hotel room, looking at the lake in the last of the evening light. "One more thing," he said. "Did anyone mention the woman who came for the shelf on Wednesday?" Beverly hesitated. Word travels in a small town. A few people mentioned it. "What did they say?" "They said they were sorry it happened. They said it wasn't the first time someone from the city had treated a local tradesperson that way. And they said Silas hadn't mentioned it to anyone himself. They only knew because a delivery driver was waiting down the lane and saw the Range Rover leave without the shelf." August set down his glass. He didn't tell anyone. Not one person. August was silent long enough that Beverly asked if he was still there. "I'm thinking," he said. A long time ago, before Fairchild Hospitality was anything at all, he had worked as a site foreman on construction jobs outside Kingston. He remembered a winter when his truck broke down on the highway and a man in a flatbed stopped, towed him to a garage in the next town, refused any payment, and drove away before August could get his name. That single unrewarded act of kindness had shaped the way August ran his business for the next 40 years. He had been trying to pay it forward ever since, in the way that a person tries to repay something that can't actually be repaid. He had been building a foundation quietly for the past 3 years, not a corporate endowment designed to generate press releases and photo opportunities, a real one, focused on trades education, on funding the gap year of apprenticeships that young people from rural communities couldn't afford to survive without an income, on supporting small craftspeople in towns that had been steadily hollowing out for a generation. He had the money. He had the legal structure and a board of 3 people he trusted completely. What he had not been able to find, despite looking carefully for a long time, was the right person to lead it. The person had to understand this kind of work from the inside, had to have made the choice many times over many years to do right by people even when it cost them something personally, had to be someone that working families in small towns would actually trust, because the money was meant to reach those families and not get lost in the space between intention and delivery. "Beverly," he said, "I need the trust documents and the certification package ready by Monday morning." A pause, the full package. "Yes." Another pause. "August, you've known this man 4 days." "I haven't known him at all," he said quietly. "I've been watching what he does when nobody is watching. That's a different thing." On Monday morning, Silas arrived before 7. Lottie had been dropped at school. The shelf still stood against the wall. He had decided over the weekend to offer it to the community center if Gemma never collected it, which seemed increasingly likely. He had just put the kettle on when a small convoy of black vehicles turned into the lane. 3 of them, careful and unhurried, they pulled into the lot and stopped. Silas watched from the doorway. This was not a normal occurrence in Tanner Falls, and he could already see his neighbor's dog at the fence examining the situation with open suspicion. A younger man in a good suit stepped out of the lead vehicle and opened the rear door of the second one. An elderly man emerged, silver-haired, upright, unhurried, gray wool coat, the settled, undramatic authority of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone. He walked toward the shop and extended his hand. "Mr. Greer, my name is August Fairchild. I'd be grateful for a few minutes if you can spare them." Silas looked at him for a moment. The name registered slowly. Fairchild. Yes. Gemma Fairchild's father. "I am." August said it without apology or qualification. "I was parked along the road last Wednesday. I watched the entire exchange." Silas said nothing. "I owe you an apology on behalf of my daughter," August continued. "What she did was wrong. I want you to know clearly that I understand that." Silas stepped back from the door. "Come in." They sat in the small back office, which smelled of sawdust and linseed oil and the dry warmth of old wood in a well-used room. August looked through the window at the photograph above the workbench and at the school drawings pinned to the wall. Careful pencil drawings of animals and trees with a child's name printed precisely in each corner. "Your daughter?" August asked. "Lottie. She's 9. August nodded. He placed a large envelope on the desk between them. "Before you open it," he said, "I want to tell you why it's there." He explained what he had done over the past 4 days, what Beverly had found. He didn't soften it or dress it up. He said he had been watching Silas the way he always watched people he was considering trusting with something that mattered, by paying attention to what they did when there was nothing to gain from doing the right thing. Silas listened without interrupting. When August finished, he pushed the envelope forward. Silas opened it carefully. Inside were several pages of legal documents and, clipped to the front, a certified check. He looked at it for a long time. $18 million. His hands did not tremble, which he noticed with a kind of detached surprise. He checked the number twice to be certain he was reading it correctly. The number did not change. "This can't be right," he said. "It's correct." He stopped. He looked up. "Why?" August leaned forward slightly. "I've been building a foundation for 3 years. The August Fairchild Trades and Community Trust. The goal is to fund skills training programs, close the apprenticeship gap, provide workshop grants for craftspeople in rural communities, and support workers displaced by mill closures and automation. The legal structure is in place. The board is in place. What I don't have is the right person to lead it." Silas waited. "That person needs to understand this work from the inside. They need to have made the choice again and again to do right by people, even when it costs them personally. They need to be someone that working families in places like Tanner Falls will trust, because the money is meant to reach those families." August looked around the room quietly. "I spent a great deal of time looking for that person. On Wednesday, I found him in a woodworking shop in eastern Ontario because my daughter behaved badly and I happened to be parked down the road." Silas set the check down very carefully on the desk. "I'm a carpenter," he said. "I run a shop by myself. I don't have any background in." "I know exactly what background you have," August said. "I'm not looking for a career administrator. I have those. I'm looking for someone who knows what a $285 invoice means to the person writing it and what it means to have it dismissed." The room was quiet. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post by the lot and regarded the unfamiliar vehicles with frank suspicion. "The $18 million, Silas said finally. That's the operational endowment for the programs. The foundation is separately capitalized. The $18 million funds the first 3 years of programming. Your role would be to direct where it goes." Silas sat with that. He thought about Vera Pollock's kitchen chair. He thought about Devon and the porch step and the toddler who'd been navigating it every morning. He thought about Bernard Lecomte loading a cabinet into his truck with the careful dignity of a man who found it genuinely difficult to accept help from anyone. He thought about every person in Tanner Falls and every town like Tanner Falls where there were people who did good, honest work and still couldn't get ahead of the numbers no matter how careful they were. "I'd need to learn a great deal," he said. "Yes," August said, "and I'd need to learn from you. That's how it's supposed to work." 3 weeks later, Gemma Fairchild drove back to Tanner Falls alone. No assistant, no Range Rover. She came in a plain dark sedan that she parked in the gravel lot without ceremony. She walked into the shop carrying a small envelope and placed it on the counter. Inside was a check for $285, a modest amount of interest she had calculated herself, and a handwritten note on plain paper. She had written it by hand. Silas understood, without her explaining it, what that meant. She said she had been wrong. She said she had become the kind of person she would not have respected, and she had known it for longer than she wanted to admit, and she was sorry. She said the shelf had been collected and installed in the Muskoka lobby, and that it was, in fact, exactly right. She did not ask for forgiveness outright. The note said what it said and left the rest where it belonged, with him. Silas read it through once and set it down. "Thank you for coming back," he said. She looked around the shop slowly, the tools on their hooks, the half-finished work on the benches, the photograph above the window, Lottie's drawings covering the office wall. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, the way light changes in a room when a cloud moves past the window. "My father thinks very highly of you," she said. "He's a good man." She nodded once slowly. "He is. He's always been a better one than me." She picked up her keys. "I hope the work goes well for you, Mr. Greer. I mean that honestly." After she left, Silas stood in the open doorway for a while. The oaks along the lane had gone fully orange. The light in late October in eastern Ontario had a particular quality he had always loved, low and gold and unhurried, as if the whole landscape understood there was no point rushing the last of the warmth. He thought about Karen and what she would have made of the past 3 weeks. She would have laughed first, probably. The good kind of laugh, the kind that could hold absurdity without cruelty. Then she would have gotten practical, asked the right questions, made the lists. She had always been better than him at moving from feeling a thing to actually doing something about it. He was still learning that part. He thought about Lottie, who had sat in this office 3 weeks ago and asked, without drama, why the woman hadn't paid. He had given her the best answer he had at the time. He was going to have to find a way to explain everything that had happened since, and he wasn't entirely sure yet where to start. The Greer & Co. Community Trades Foundation held its first public information session in the Tanner Falls Community Hall on a Thursday evening in January, during a cold snap that kept the temperature below -20 for most of the week. 43 people came, which was more than anyone had expected given the weather. Young people who wanted to learn a trade and couldn't find apprenticeship placements. Workers in their 50s who had been displaced when the mills consolidated and didn't know where to start over. Single parents trying to figure out how to upgrade a certification without losing the income they couldn't afford to interrupt. Silas stood at the front of the room and talked plainly about what the foundation could do and what it couldn't. He was careful to be honest about both. He answered questions for an hour and a half without once checking his phone. Lottie sat in the back row beside Lecomte, who had come out of curiosity and ended up signing on to mentor 2 apprenticeship candidates before the evening was out, which was not something he had planned when he walked through the door. After the hall emptied and the chairs were being folded and stacked, Lottie found her father collecting papers at the front. "Dad," she said. He looked at her. "Is all of this because of that woman, the one who didn't pay?" Silas thought about it honestly before answering. It was the kind of question that deserved an honest answer. "It started there," he said. "But no, it's because of every person who was in this room tonight." Lottie considered that the way she considered most things. Thoroughly, without hurrying. She had her mother's way of sitting with a thought before she was done with it. "Mom would have liked this," she said. Silas looked at her for a moment. His daughter, 9 years old, in a folding chair in a community hall in Tanner Falls in January, saying a true thing as simply as if she were reading it off a page. "Yeah," he said quietly, "she really would have." Outside, the cold had deepened and the stars above Tanner Falls were very clear, the way they got in January when the air held no moisture and nothing stood between a person and how far the sky actually went.